Okay, today we're going to be learning Pesachim Daf Yud Zayin. Today's daf is sponsored by Betsy Melman in honor of Natalie Taylor. Natalie, thank you for inspiring me to start learning Daf Yomi with Hadran. You're a true friend, and I'm grateful for your encouragement and support during these uncertain times. And by Bill Futornik in memory of his grandmother, Ruth Fearing Staras, Rivka Rachel Bat Chaim Tzvi Zichronah Livracha. And finally, for Refuah Shlema of Tamara Blima Bat Gita, Yosef Matityahu Ben Tila, and Gita Bat Sima, who are struggling with COVID-19. We're going to start right now with the end of yesterday's daf. So I want to point out a few things that we've seen here. We have on the one hand, two opinions. Okay, I'll go even further back. We started with a whole debate yesterday, the beginning of yesterday's daf, between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar about Safek Mashkin li Tameh, but li Tameh Acherim Tahor, which we said was different Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar, but then we struggled. Because remember, Rabbi Meir says they become Tameh Mashkim on a Torah level, but they don't pass on Tuma on a Torah level. Rabbi Elazar seemed to have said, though differently than him, that there is no Tuma Mashkim from the Torah. Okay, liquids do not become impure by the Torah at all. Then we have Rabbi Yehuda, who says they're lakol Tameh. They're Tameh for everything. Okay, they're on a Torah level. We're always going to treat them stringently if there's a suffix about whether they became Tameh or whether they passed on impurity, because they are forbidden on a Torah level. And then we saw Rabbi Shimon, who said, well, yes, from a Torah level, they can pass on impurity to foods, but not to vessels. So we saw a range of opinions here. From there, we went into this opinion of Rabbi Elazar, who said mashkim have no, the liquids are not Tameh. Okay, Ein Tum'ah Mashkin Kol Ikar. How do we know this? And his proof was from Yosef ben Yoezer Ish Treda, who said that all the liquids in the temple, now it's not all the liquids, but remember, yesterday we discussed, and today we're going to see there's actually a debate about this. Water and blood that are in the Beit Mitbachaya. The Beit Mitbachaya was the slaughtering area, not other liquids. Like, what are other liquids? So the oil that goes in the meal offerings, the wine libations. There were water libations on Sukkot. The blood that gets sprinkled on the altar. Those are different things that we can view those are things we can view in a different way. So now we're dealing with, we had a machloket Rav and Shmuel, a very important machloket. What is Rabbi Yosef ben Yoezer Ish Treda talking about? In the Beit Mitbachaya, we understand it's the blood and the water right now. Let's just assume that happens in the slaughtering area. The question becomes, is it, again, based on this other machloket, is it that, again, the assumption is if the rabbi said this doesn't apply in the temple, that must mean it's only rabbinic in nature. And then the debate becomes, Rav says everything is rabbinic when it comes to mashkin, and that's why everything is off the table in the temple, meaning they don't become impure and obviously then don't pass on impurity. According to Shmuel, they do become impure because the fact that they become impure is a deoraita. Mashkin they can become impure midoraita. They just don't pass on impurity. And that makes sense in the temple. We don't want them to pass on impurity because it'll mess up other things, but they themselves can become impure. So we brought 5 questions so far. We're on our 6th and last question on Rav. Tashma. At the bottom of Tetzayin Amabet, we're going to start quoting psukim from Chagai. I recommend you read a little bit about Chagai on our site. Shuli Mishkin in Flashback wrote a whole article about it, about what was going on in the history. It was the beginning of the return to the temple. People weren't coming back. There's a bit of an issue. And you see here, he starts quizzing the Kohanim that are coming back. You can imagine he's quizzing them because, first of all, the people weren't so excited about coming back. He's trying to encourage them back. On the other hand, he also wants to protect the temple and know that people know the laws. So he starts quizzing them. Hein Yisa Ish, 4 lines from the bottom of Tetzayin Amabet. Tashma. Let's learn from here a question against Rav. Hein Yisa Ish basar kodesh b'knaf begadol. The assumption is a man carries basar kodesh. They don't mean meat that's sanctified. What it seems to mean is he has a sheretz. Okay, and there's a creature, one of these ones that become tameh. They're an avatuma. He carries it under his cloak. V'naga b'knafo el alechem, and he touches this sheretz. Now comes in contact with bread. What's the bread going to be? This is a good review of our levels of tuma. The bread becomes a rishon. Ve'el hanizid, the bread touches the nizid, which is a stew. That becomes a sheni. Ve'el hayayin, then it touches wine, which becomes a shlishi. Ve'el hashemen, the wine now touches oil, which becomes a revi. Ve'el kol ma'achal, or shemen, or any other food. Okay, shemen is a liquid, food is a solid. Hayikdash, will it become tameh? Vayanu ha'kohanim v'yomru lo. And the kohanim said no. Va'amarav, now the question is, it doesn't say so in the Torah. You didn't get a yes or no answer. Okay, you didn't get like a check. Okay, that was the right answer, that was the wrong answer. So we're going to see there's a debate, Rav and Shmuel, about whether the kohanim were accurate about this or not. Va'amarav ish debish kahane. Okay, he says they were wrong. Okay, why were they wrong? Because they said lo, meaning they don't become impure. The kohanim said there's no impurity here. Rav says they're totally wrong. Of course there's impurity. Now, something strange here. If Rav thinks there's no deoraita, right? Mashkim aren't deoraita. So now they say, midi utama ela lerav, mashke be mitbachaya tnan. And Rav holds that what kind of, and again, this is kind of referencing this machloka we're going to see later today, but Rav holds that when the Mishnah said about Yossi ben Yoezra, that he testified about Beit Mitbachaya, that the wording was Beit Mitbachaya. Mitbachaya is the slaughtering area. Tane. Aval mashke Beit Mitbachaya mitame. Only the Beit Mitbachaya are exempt from laws of Tumah in the Mikdash. But he thinks that the Beit Mitbachaya are mitame. Okay, so, sorry, what I forgot to explain was the question. This was already the answer, my mistake. First, we're going to say, basically, it sounds like Rav is saying there's Tumat Mashkin in the Mikdash. And we said, according to Rav, there isn't Tumat Mashkin in the Mikdash. And here it seems like the Tumah does go, because again, Chagai asked the Kohanim, does Tumah pass down to Revi'i B'Tumah when it comes to these liquids of wine and oil? And the answer was yes. Not only do they become Tameh, they can also pass on impurity. And Rav seemed to say, right, there is no such thing as that in the temple. But then the answer is no. Because he said the Kohanim were wrong. They said no, and the answer is really yes. They are Tameh. So how could they be Tameh and Tameh other things according to Rav? That there's no Tumat Mashkin D'Oraita even to become Tameh. And how do we know that from the temple? Because the temple, all those laws were up in the air. So the answer is Midu Tama Elel Rav. Wait a minute. But the whole reason of Rav is Mashke Beit Midbachayatane. Right? They say it's mitbachaya, which means beit midbachaya mitame. The exemption in the temple was only for the blood and water in the slaughter area. It wasn't for items that go on the altar, like the wine and the oil and all those. So those can become tameh according to him. The rabbis didn't say, oh, we're not going to put tumah there. First of all, it's very logical to say that. If you think about what we talked about yesterday, that think about the temple and the blood spurting out from the sacrifices and the water spraying all over to try to wash out the area. Those get all over the place. But when you're talking about an oil libation and a wine libation, they're very careful about those. There's no reason to start being lenient here and saying, oh, there's no tumah there. Okay, so one could see logic for his answer. Gufa. But now we're going to go more in depth into these psukim in Chagai and try to figure them out. Rav Amar ish tebish kahane, u'Shmuel Amar lo ish tebish kahane. Well, in fact, Shmuel disagrees. Shmuel thinks that the Kohanim were actually right, that it doesn't become tameh. So now we have to understand Shmuel. Rav, we already explained, it makes sense. So Rav Amar, and let's explain it again, ish tebish kahane, the Kohanim were wrong. Revi'i b'kodesh ba'al minayu. What was his question? He wanted to know, and this makes sense also, the Chagai wanted to check. In the temple, remember, okay, let's go through our levels of Tumah. An Ava Tumah can be Mitame, a Rishon a Sheni. That's all everywhere, in the temple, outside the temple, right? Anything sanctified, not sanctified, across the board. But once you get to Sheni can only be Mitame, Truma, and Kodshim to become a Shlishi. And a Shlishi can only be Mitame, Kodshim, right? And it's called Posel, right? It messes up Kodshim. So Revi'i is something strictly for the temple. Now here they were living for 70 years without the temple. These Kohanim probably had never worked in the temple before, right? Presumably if they were, like they weren't alive at the time or babies at the time, they don't know anything about it. So he wanted to check, do you still know your laws? Do you know that there's Revi'i? And that's why it said, the sheretz touches the bread, the stew, the wine, the oil, getting down to Revi'i. So now they say, Baal Minayu, Revi'i b'kodesh ba'al minayu, that was his question. V'amrei le tahol, and they said, no, it's not tameh. And he says, you're wrong. It is tameh, right? there's such a thing as Revi, and maybe that was how he taught them Revi. Ushmuel Amar, lo ishtabish kahane. Shmuel says, no, they didn't make any mistake. Chamishi b'kodesh ba'al minayu, va'amre le tahor. His question was, does it pass down from Revi'i to Chamishi? Does it go one more level? So now they say, va'amre le tahor, and they said, no, it doesn't pass down. And he said, you're right. So now, Bishlam Rav makes a lot of sense because that's how we explain the pasuk. Kind of dichtiv arba'ah. That's why there's 4 things mentioned. Lechem, nizid, yain, b'shemen, right? The lechem became the rishon. It touched the sheretz. From there, sheni, shlishi, revi'i. But ela l'shmuel chamisha minale. But Shmuel, where does he get 5 from? Miktiv. So now they say, wait a minute. Miktiv v'naga knafo. It doesn't say, and his knafo, which they assume is referring, even though the knaf is really his clothing, but they assume naga knafo, they assume it means the sheretz. Doesn't mean, we talked about that the sheretz moved to the lechem directly. V'naga biknafo ktiv. B'masha naga biknafo. Okay? Naga biknafo is what touched the sheretz. So we're basically saying the sheretz touched the clothing, because remember, he put it in his cloak. The clothing becomes the rishon. That touches the bread, which becomes a sheni. The bread touches the stew, which is a shlishi. The stew touches the wine, which is revi, and the wine touches the oil, which is a chamishi. And then you see, look, the whole point is, and by the way, we're going to explain this pasuk in a 3rd way later on. But that explains Shmuel saying they actually didn't make any mistake. Okay. Tashma. Yeah, so Julie, I see you're pointing out that the Steinsaltz translates as, I noticed that, as either stew or wine or oil, which is strange, but we're going to actually explain it that way later. So it could be that Steinsaltz was reading it as if he understood that was the pshat of the pasuk, and then it gets darshaned in different ways. Clearly, the Gemara at this point thinks it means different stages, but it could be that the simple reading of the verse is either it touches this or this or that, which is going to be an interpretation we're going to suggest in a little while. So there seem to be many different ways one could read this pasuk. So far we've seen, okay, I'll already say 3 because Julie already pointed that one out, which is either it means the sheretz touches bread or stew or wine or oil, and then they're all rishon basically, or it touches the bread, then the bread touches that and it goes and then some till we get to revi. Or like we said now, the sheretz touches the clothing and then it goes on until chamishi. Okay, so now we're going to bring up a question. Tashma, vayomer chagai, im yigat, and we have Rav and Shmuel now. So here comes a question. Im yigat me nefesh b'chol ele hayitama, v'anu hakohanim v'amru yitma. This is going to be a question on Rav. So now Chagai asked them another question. That was about a sheretz. What about if yigat me nefesh? Someone who, now again, tmei nefesh, it sounds like it's talking about a tmei mate who's an avatuma, but we're going to see later, the Gemara is going to assume we're talking about the dead body itself. A tmei nefesh is the nefesh that is tamei because it died. Okay, the dead body itself, which is a higher level, avi avot tatuma. So im yigat me nefesh b'chol ele hayitama. What if that touched these? Now again, all different interpretations. Either it means it touched them directly, or it means it touched one and it touched the other, that touched the other, that touched the other. So, hayitma, vayanu akonim vayomru yitma. And they said, in fact, yes, it will make it tameh. Now, in this case, the assumption is, of course it would, okay? Even if we say that before it was talking about a chamishi, in this case, assuming we're talking about a tmei nefesh, it's going to be revi'i, basically, because you're starting one level higher, because you're at avi avodah tuma, which makes the next thing avatuma, and then some. So now, bishlama l'shmuel. So clearly, we assume they said the right answer here. So therefore, when Shmuel says they said, now there's going to be this assumption. If they knew the answer to one question, we assume they mustn't have known the answer to the other question. So therefore, Shmuel, who said, bishlama l'shmuel, midahacha lo ishtibish hatamnami lo ishtibish. They knew this one, they obviously also knew the other one. Because remember, Shmuel said they were right. There is no chamishi. According to Rav, though, why would they mess up in one and they wouldn't mess up in the other? So Amarav, Nachman, Amarav, Ravur, we're going to have 2 different answers. Either bikin him b'tumat meit, ve'ein bikin him b'tumat sheretz. Maybe you could say they knew the laws of tumat meit. Tumat meit is definitely stricter. So maybe they were up on some of the laws and not other laws. They knew tumat mate, things that come from dead people, but they didn't know the laws about shretzi. That's one way of reading it. Ravina Amar, Hatam Revi'i, Hacha Shlishi. Says, oh, wait, there it was Revi'i. This is Shlishi. And that's why I said that you could read this as that was the Avi Avot HaTumah. Now, what's Avi Avot HaTumah, right? So again, let's start from the beginning. If the Avi Avot HaTumah came in contact with bread, the bread will be an Avatuma. The bread passes on to the stew. That's a Rishon. The stew passes on to the wine. That's a Sheni. The wine passes on to the oil. That's a Shlishi. So you could say they knew laws about Shlishi, which makes sense because Truma they were still dealing with. But Kodshim they hadn't been dealing with since the temple was destroyed. They didn't know those laws. So that's another possibility as to why Rav says that one halacha they knew and one halacha they didn't know. But Tashma, we're going to have another question. Vayan Chagai Vayomar. Now, this is a question on Shmuel. Shmuel said they knew the laws in both situations. Now, if they know the laws, then this pasuk doesn't make so much sense. And again, just like yesterday, we're going to have a case where the first part of the verse is quoted, but it's really the second part of the verse that's important. So if you have the Torah or look inside, or the sheet, on the sheet that I made, I put it in there, the whole pasuk. Vayan Chagai Vayomar. Ken ha'amazeh v'chen hagoy hazeh lefanaynu Hashem. Okay, like this is the people, this is the nation there is. And everything they do and everything they sacrifice will be impure. This sounds like they don't know what they're doing, right? Which sounds like Rav and not Shmuel. So Bishlama l'Rav, which is what the Gemara is going to say. Bishlama means, right? This makes a lot of sense according to Rav, right? Bishlama comes from the word shalem, whole, it's complete. Rav is complete, makes sense. Hainu d'chtiv tamei. That's why they were called impure people. Aval elu l'shmuel amai tamei. Why would they be called tamei if they answer both questions correctly? They obviously know what they're doing. So why would he say you're all tamei? So the Gemara suggests it's mu'e kamatama. Maybe it's rhetorical. He may be saying v'choma seyedehem asher krivu sham tamehu. What, you think it's all going to be tamei? No, these people know what they're doing. But the Gemara doesn't like that. They say, what do you mean? It says, and thus all their actions are impure. It doesn't really sound like that could be read rhetorically. So there's a different reason why they're called tamei, not because they didn't know laws of tum and tara. And we know that the word tamei is a borrowed word. It's used in all different kinds of ways that don't always mean impure. Sometimes, you could say you have impure motives. That doesn't mean impurity of, in the laws of tum and tara. So the reason why it says this about them is because they were bad in other ways. They were corrupt or whatever it was. They were doing other things bad. And therefore he said, I don't want these people in my temple. They're tme'im. And exactly, I wanted to say that, Gita, like a non-kosher animal is called tameh. Even though it's not impure, it's just called tameh. It's another word for it. Gufa. Now we're going to go into this machloket I mentioned about the Beit Mitbachaya. Rav Tane Mashke Beit Mitbachaya. When it comes to that Mishnah where it said that Yosef ben Yoezer testified both about the grasshopper, the locust that was kosher, and about the liquids in the Beit Mitbachaya, according to Rav, the Girsa is Mitbachaya. Okay, from tabach. Tabach is to slaughter. Levi Tana Mashke Beit Midbachaya. Why Midbachaya? Midbachaya means Mizbeach. Okay, Mizbeach, the Dalet and the Zion, we talked about this yesterday. They switch in Aramaic. Midbachaya means Mizbachaya. Okay, the Mizbeach. So now again, what are we talking about? Either it's the blood and the water of the slaughtering and the cleaning, or it's the water libations, the wine libations, the oil that both were used as libations and also were mixed up in the dough for the mincha, and the blood that gets sprinkled on the altar. So he says those are the ones that don't become tameh. So now we're going to have again. Now what we're going to try to do is try to figure out the interrelation between that debate and the debate about Rav and Shmuel about can things become tameh and not pass on impurity according to Shmuel, or according to Rav, these things don't become tameh at all. So Levi has to fit in with one of those. Okay, so now they're going to say like this. Levi, hani ha'isvira like Shmuel. He must hold like Shmuel that they become tameh, but they don't pass on impurity. Why? The Amar, right? And why Shmuel? The Amar, here's the quote about Shmuel. Therefore, in other words, how else would he explain these verses in Chagai? Chagai says all these things become tamei. Now, not only did Chagai say they all become tamei, they all also pass on impurity. And this is where we go back to what you quoted before, Julie, about the Steinsaltz. Here comes in the Steinsaltz interpretation. Mishkachala, how would you explain those psukim in Chagai? Dinage kulu berishon. It's not this one touched that one, and that one touched that one, and that one touched that one, because then we'd have wine passing on impurity to oil, which Rav and Shmuel both think, of course, you can't do that. So you'd have to say that Levi holds that it can become impure, and that's why Chagai is talking about, yes, these all do become impure, but they become impure only if they each directly come in contact with the sheretz. So that would be, right, that would be the case of or. Okay, so if they were to touch any of those things, or even you could say if the clothing came in contact with any of those items, or the Tmei Nefesh came in contact with any of those items directly, not that they pass on impurity at the next level. No, according to Levi, there's no way to read it that way. But there's also no way to read it like Rav, that they don't become Tamei at all. Because again, Rav said, whatever it is, whether it's mitbachaya or midbachaya, Rav thought it was mitbachaya, but if you say midbachaya, Rav thinks they don't become tamei at all, and that is clearly not the case from these verses in Chagai. So that's the first issue we're going to deal with. So therefore, it must be, right, mishkachala denage kulu berishon. It must be these verses are talking about, each of them directly touched the problem item. Ella, or right, you could say berishon, either it means a rishon l'tumah, maybe they all touch the bread, or maybe you could say berishon, the first thing that was the original tumah. Ella isav lekerav de amar dachan mamash, but if you say like Rav, who says no, whatever it is, the bait blank, fill in the blank, and according to Levi, it would be the things that go on the altar are dachan mamash, they never become impure. There's no way to read it this way, and therefore these psukim would make no sense, and therefore I'll call chaka Shmuel svira. So Levi must hold like Shmuel. Now, what about Shmuel? Okay, well, the Shmuel, the question, we have like this triangle. We have Shmuel and Rav who disagree about Tuma. Is it not Tameh at all, or it's Tameh, it just doesn't pass on? And we have Rav and Levi who disagree about, is it the Beit Mitbachaya or the Beit Midbachaya? So first we want to know what Levi holds about the other machloket. And now we say, what does Shmuel hold about the Rav and Shmuel machloket? About the Rav and Levi machloket. Does he think it's Beit Mitbachaya or Beit Midbachaya? So you can see, by the way, they sound kind of the same, why people were confused at the tet and the dalid. Okay, so l'shmuel hani cha'isav kerav. Shmuel must hold like Rav about beit mitbechaya, that we're talking about the blood and the water. Titane mashke beit mitbechaya, aval mashke beit mitbechaya achrine nami mitamu. Why? Because revi'i hu delo avid chamishi. Remember, we read that pasuk as saying, the first verse as saying, he asked, does a revi'i make a chamishi? And the answer was no, and they were correct. That's how Shmuel read it. Hashlishi avid revi'i, but the inference from there is that a shlishi would make a revi'i, because he was asking about revi'i to chamishi. Ela isav like Levi, but if you said it, he holds like Levi. Detane mashke be mitbachaya, and therefore, and again, if you say be mitbachaya with a tet, then the psukim and Chagai have absolutely nothing to do with this issue, and therefore we have no problem. But if you say that the issue is be midbachaya, the ones that go on the altar, and then we have to figure out, well, how do the verses work out with this? So if that's the case, that he would say that, my area revi'i de lo avid chamishi. The question should be not about, does a 4th degree tuma create tuma for a 5th degree? Ella afilu shlishi urevi'i nami lo avde. And even it wouldn't make a shlishi, it wouldn't make a sheni, it wouldn't make anything. You wouldn't be able to pass on. And therefore, they basically say, right, therefore it doesn't make sense that he reads it that way. Al korche ke Rav svirale. It must be he holds like Rav. Okay, so we now have, like I said, it was this triangle. Who holds like who within that triangle? Now we're going to bring a braita to support Rav and a braita to support Levi. By the way, not only, I see, Tova, you're saying the difference, it's good we have a speech therapist here. A dalet and a tet is just voice and voiceless. So it's very easy to confuse, which is very good. And I want to even prove it further from Hebrew language. Sometimes you have, like in hitz pa'el, depending on what the next, okay, if you know anything about grammar, if not, I'm not going to go into all the details, but if you have hitz palel, let's say, So sometimes you have complicated words where instead of the taf, we put in a tet, and sometimes we put in a dalid, okay, like his dakef, okay, where dalid comes instead of the tet. So even in linguistically, sometimes that letter is switched. Okay, that's just an aside. Now we're going to get back to our topic. We have Rav and we have Levi. Rav says it was talking about the blood and the water, and Levi says it was talking about all the items that go on the altar. Again, that there's no tum and tara for them. They don't become tameh. Again, what it means they don't become tameh is different according to Rav and according to Levi also. But now we're focusing on which items. So now we're going to bring a braita Tanya Kavatei de Rav and Tanya Kavatei de Levi. A braita to support Rav, a braita to support Levi. Tanya Kavatei de Levi. Hadam v'hayayin v'hashemen v'hamayim. Those are obviously our be midbechaya. Mashkei be midbechaya. Okay, these are the mashkim that go on the altar. Shenitmeu bifnim v'hutzian lachutz. They became tamei inside the temple area. Okay, they were inside. And then what happened? Somebody took them outside. Now it's forbidden to take items outside the temple that are sanctified. You can't. Once they're sanctified inside, you can't take them outside. We'll get to all this much later in the Gemaras, but that's just something to know. Tehorim. Okay, what does this mean? Now the question is not, okay, it's forbidden to take it outside. Let's say you did. At this point, they're tameh. They're not in the temple anymore. Now we said things don't pass on tumah in the temple, right? Now Levi is saying not only do they not pass on tumah in the temple, but if they're taken outside, then they don't pass on tumah anymore, okay? Because once they were sanctified in the temple and then became impure, whatever status they had in the temple continues outside the temple. So, and it's true, you do want to remove the tumah. Here, we're talking, right, that's true, okay? We're not going to get into all the details here, but right now, let's keep focused on our things. So, the point is, they don't pass on tumah. That's exactly bay, right? Either mitbachaya or midbachaya. Here it's obviously bay midbachaya, and that supports Levi. So now they say, wait a minute. But wait, the second is, what if, and this is why the hotza'ah lachutz is important, okay, Gita, according to your question. So hotzi'an lachutz, where am I lost my place. Okay. Nitzmeu bachutz, the end of the sixth line from the bottom. If though it happened the reverse, first they were nitmeu outside, and then hechnisan bifnim, which you're not supposed to do either, but then tmeim, then this doesn't have the exemption that we normally have for the liquids that are inside the temple because they were already disqualified before we even brought them inside. So now the Gemara says, so first of all, that proves Levi. We're done with that because it's clear that this rule about mid bechaya, right? It refers, the rule about purity in the temple relates to items that go on the altar. So the Gemara says, Ini, is that really true though? Is it really true that if we take them outside, that they know they retain their status from before, that they can't pass on tumah even outside the temple? Didn't Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi say, V'hama Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Mashkei be midbechaya, okay, again, midbechaya, the mizbeach, lo amru dachan ela bimkoman. We only say they're pure when they're in their native place. What's that? In the temple. Sounds like when you take them out of their home turf, outside the temple, those laws don't apply. So they say, lo, when it says, my lav l'meute nitmu b'fnim v'otzian lachutz, when it says bim komam, what's it coming to exclude? It sounds like it's coming to exclude if you take it out of the temple, right? Exactly the case we said. But they say, no, that's not what it's coming to exclude. What it's coming to exclude is the other case. Nitmu b'chutz v'chnisan b'fnim, right? It means, no, it's coming to exclude in their place means when they became tamei in their place, but not if they became tamei outside. So then they say, v'hai bim koman ka'amar, but it says in their place. It sounds like it really means only in the temple and not if you were to take them outside the temple. So they say, no. Hachi kamar. You could read it like this. Lo amru dachan ela shenitmeu bim koman. That the bim koman is referring to where they became tamei, not where are they now. Okay? And that was just an aside question. Now we're back to the braita that support Rav. Tanya kavatei de Rav. Hadam v'hamayim mashke be mitbechaya. Okay, now we can see why this is going to support Rav. The items that are in the slaughtering area, shenitmeu, bein bekelim, bein bekarka teorim. If they became impure, whether they're put in a vessel or whether they're in the ground, it doesn't matter. They're tehorim. There's no tumah by them. Okay, that supports Rav, right? It means they don't become tamei, and we're talking about the blood and the water, clearly, and not the other items. That Braita continues, and we're going to get back to Rabbi Shimon soon. Rabbi Shimon disagrees and says, "Bekelim tmeim bekarka torim." The exemption is only if they're still in the ground. And this is for a totally different reason, which we're going to get to soon, which is because water in the ground, and we're going to see it's only water and not blood, water in the ground has the potential to purify. And therefore, water in the ground doesn't become tameh because it itself purifies. So therefore, it itself can't become tameh. But if you put it in a vessel, then already it's not on the ground anymore. And then we're going to say it's tameh. Okay, so Rabbi Shimon disagrees, but the point is that we're talking about the Beit Mitbechaya, that according to the Tanakama is tahor. And that supports Rav. Until now, we've been assuming, we saw yesterday, Tumat Mashkin is derabanan, right? And then there was just a debate, Rav and Shmuel, is Tumat Mashkin, or also between the Tanaim, Tumat Mashkin, that's derabanan, do we mean that it's tameh, mida oraita, it just doesn't pass on impurity on a rabbinic, right, on a Torah level? Or is it not tameh at all by Torah law? And that's why in the temple, whatever was not Torah law, they were able to override. Comes Rav Papa with a totally different way of reading things. And we're going to see they ask two questions on him and don't have any answers. So it seems like the Gemara doesn't like this approach, but he has a different approach. Amar Rav Papa, afilu lamanda amar tumat mashkin deoraita. Even if you say there is liquids become tameh according to the Torah, they become tameh, they pass on impurity according to the Torah, and yet we can still override it in the temple. And I know a lot of people were asking this question yesterday. Mashke beit mitbechaya, sorry, I said it wrong. You see here. Hilchata gemira. The laws about in the temple where they repealed this, that's halacha l'moshe Sinai, meaning it's not that the rabbis came along and said, oh, this is permitted by Torah law, so let's override it in the temple. No, this is forbidden by Torah law. And were it not that we had a very old Masoret, some people say actually directly from Moshe, other people say it just means a very old tradition that basically no one disagrees with. There's a very old tradition that in the temple, this just didn't, it wasn't a thing. Okay, meaning it doesn't matter Doraita Daraban. Doraita, really, there is Tumat Mashkin, and it becomes tameh, and it passes on impurity. But there's a separate reason here. This is because it's halacha l'moshe Sinai. Once you say halacha l'moshe Sinai, it's like an end game. You can't argue with that, right? We don't. There's not much you can say because it's not logical. It's not. It's a tradition. That's our tradition. That's the way it is. So Amalei Rav Huna Bereid Rav Natan the Rav Papa. So first question is this: V'alahada Amar Rabbi Elazar. But what about Rabbi Elazar's shita? Ein tum'al l'mashkin kol ikar. Remember, he said there's no tumat mashkin at all in the Torah. And where did he prove it from? Teda, his proof was Yossi ben Yoezer ish tzreda mashke bet mitbechaya dachan. His proof that there is no mashkin from the Torah was from Yossi ben Yoezer. Now, why is this a problem? Because just like I said, once you say halacha l'moshe Sinai, there's nothing to argue about. Not only that, but you can't bring logical arguments from it either. You can't try to prove what's by Torah law from halacha l'moshe Sinai. So he says, "Ihilchata gamirali mi gamrina mina." If it's halacha l'moshe Sinai, then Rabbi Elazar can't possibly have derived from there that there's no tumah midoraita. In other words, that whole thing doesn't make sense if you say that the whole law of Beit Mitbachaya happened halacha l'moshe Sinai. So that's question number one. Now you could say it's a debate whether it is a halacha l'moshe Sinai or not. That's a possibility, but they don't suggest that. Amale Ravina le Ravashi. Second question. The Ha Rabbi Shimon de Amar Tumat Mashkin de Oraita. Okay, this we saw yesterday in the beginning of yesterday's daf. De Tanya. We'll read it now again. Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon Omrim, when they were talking about liquids, lekelim tahorim leochlim tmeim. Liquids are de Oraita. They pass on tuma though only to other foods. They don't pass on tuma to vessels, but they do pass on tuma to food on a Torah level. The Hachaka Amar, and here what did it say in the temple? Remember, Rabbi Shimon says, Bekelim tmeim bekarka teorim, right? That in kelim, if the liquid's in kelim, then they are tmeim. If it's on the ground, they're teorim. Now, ihilchatahi, again, if it's halacha l'moshe Sinai, that there's no tumah in the mikdash, then mali bekelim, mali bekarka, then there shouldn't be a distinction between kelim and karka, okay? And therefore, kasha. So, in other words, you want to assume that Rav Papa must have held like Rabbi Shimon, who thinks that Tumat Mashkin is Doraita. But if that's the case, then we shouldn't make this distinction between Kelim and Karka. Basically, we should say, but the Halach Moshe Sinai kicks in and says there's no tum in the mikdash, period. Shouldn't matter. And he makes this distinction and really thinks there is tum in the mikdash and just not bikarka. So Amar Papa. Now we're going to talk about this opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Hada Amar Bakarka Torin Lo Shanu Alamayim. I already told you this, but now we're going to see it inside. This whole opinion of Rabbi Shimon, the Bakarka Torin, is only water. Aval dam lo. Okay, and that's because I said water itself can be a mikveh, and that's why dam. No one goes to a mikveh in blood, right? Not because it's disgusting, but because it won't do anything for you. Umayim nami lo amaran ela dahavi revit. And when we're talking about water in the ground, the only water they said is tahor is going to be water that can be a minimal size for a mikveh. Now, what's interesting about this is we always talk about minimum size of a mikveh is 40 se'ah. That's way more than a revit. Revit's revit halog. Okay, 40 se'ah is, forget how many log in each se'ah, but it's a lot more. So in any case, what do you have here? There's Torah law mikveh and there's Doraita, there's Dorabana mikveh. A mikveh for a human has to be 40 se'ah because it has to be enough space for a person to get in. But if you want to dunk a kli into a mikveh, like let's say a small needle, it just has to be big enough for the needle to fit in. For that, a revid is enough on a Torah level. And that's why he said, since in Torah level, that could be the minimum size of a mikveh, that's the minimum size that already, if it's that size on the ground, since it can theoretically purify, even though maybe by rabbinic law it can't anymore, but it could theoretically purify something really small, there could be used as a mikveh, therefore it's going to be tahor. Anything less than that will be treated as if it's in a kli and it will be tameh. Okay, Amar. Now we're going to go back to, again, we keep relating to this machloket we brought in the beginning of yesterday's daf, where we saw all different opinions about mashkim from the Torah. Now we're going to talk about Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Rabbi Yehuda omer lakol tameh. Right? Any suffix about tuma, whether it's in a kli, remember we said Rabbi Shimon was right. Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon said la'ochlin tamei and la'kelim torim. Right? They said liquids pass on impurity on a Torah level to foods, but not to vessels. But Rabbi Yehuda says lakol tamei. It sounds like for everything it's tamei, and we're going to question even vessels. Lameimar desava Rabbi Yehuda tumat mashkin l'tamei tumat kelim deoraita. That really tumat mashkin can be tamei vessels on a Torah level. Now we're going to question this. V'hatnan, it says in the Mishnah, kol kelim sheyesh lam achorayim v'tuch. Okay, this means it has an inside and an outside. It's kind of like a reversible jacket. Okay, now it's a good example because a reversible jacket, normally it's usually worn on one side. You can theoretically reverse it, but it never looks 100% on the other side. That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about things that you could theoretically turn inside out. You're going to see like a saddlebag or something like that, but you don't normally turn it inside out. So if it has an outside that's usable, even though it's less usable than the inside, and an inside, kigon, hakarim, bakasato, pillows and covers, sakin, bags, saddlecloths and mertufim, other types of bags. Nitma tocho, nitma gabo. Nitma, okay, if the inside becomes tameh, let's say a sheretz goes inside, makes it tameh, also the outside becomes tameh. So if something touches the outside of a kli, it will be tameh. Nitma gabo, but if the outside of it, since the outside is less usable than the inside, because the inside is where it holds things, and the outside theoretically could be used as an inside, but it's not usually used that way. Lo nitma tocho. So the inside doesn't become, so if a sheretz touches the outside, the inside doesn't become tameh. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. B'ameh dvarim amurim. Here comes Rabbi Yehuda, which is going to contradict what we said before. Again, Rabbi Yehuda said by us, the mashkin, it sounds like if he betame everything. Right? It's strict Torah law like everything else, even kelim. B'ameh dvarim amurim shenitmeu machmat mashkin. This is only, though, if it becomes tameh from liquids. Aval nitmeu machmat sheretz, but if it became tameh from a sheretz, like the way I described, then nitma tocho, nitma gabo, nitma gabo, nitma tocho. A sheretz is more severe than mashkin. Therefore, if the sheretz touches the outside, it actually will make the inside tameh, not like I said before. And what we said before was only talking about according to Rabbi Yehuda. That's why when I said it, it was correct. But now Rabbi Yehuda understands it differently. And he says, no, only if liquids touch the outside is it not going to make the inside tameh. It sounds like he's much more lenient about liquids than he is about a sheretz. So here comes the Gemara's question. If you think that tumat mashkin is just like a sheretz and it can pass on impurity to a vessel on a Torah level, Mali nitma machmat mashkim, mali nitma machmat sheret. There shouldn't be any difference between the two. So, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Chazar bo Rabbi Yehuda. They say Rabbi Yehuda must have changed his mind. Not the case. Ravina Amar La'olam lo hater. Now, I'm going to explain that he really didn't change his mind, although I'll already tell you that we're going to reject this answer. Okay, and in the end, he is going to also say Rabbi Yehuda must have changed his mind. But right now, he's going to try to suggest Ha b'mashkina b'im machmat yadayim, ha b'mashkina b'im machmat sheretz. There's two ways of liquids, and I talked about this before. Every time we get to liquids, we always discuss this, which is liquids are, there's a special, even though here what's interesting is many opinions think that it's not even d'oraita. However, the rabbis instituted not only tumat mashkin, let's assume we think it's not d'oraita, but then the rabbi said it is, it passes on impurity. Not only that, but if a liquid comes in contact with a food that's a sheni, it raises it up a level. And it basically makes whatever it's touching a rishon. So if liquid is touching the piece of meat that's a sheni, and the piece of meat touches another piece of meat, it will make that meat a sheni. So the liquid kind of raises it up a level. So now, that's what they're saying now is there's a difference between, okay, that wasn't actually so relevant for my purposes, actually, but it was just an interesting point about mashkin. But what they're saying here is there's two kinds of mashkin. Well, I guess it is relevant, and I'll tell you why. Because if a liquid comes in contact with a sheni, there I was talking about meat, so now I know why I started here. My hands, okay, hands are generally considered shniyot, okay? So now, if my hands touch, they're considered shniyot because I touch all sorts of things. My hands are sheni. They touch liquid. Now anything my hands touch are going to become a sheni, because my hand, it basically makes my hands up a level to a rishon. Now we touch something. That's why we do netilat yadayim, and that's why you have to dry your hands after, right? So if my hands touch liquid and the liquid, right, and my hands are impure, now that is a derabanan. That's not the same as if a liquid came in direct contact with a sheretz. Then it's a rishon in and of itself, not a rishon because the rabbi said, oh, it touched a sheni, that ups it a level to a rishon. So there's a difference between those two. One is going to be much less strict because it's only rabbinic, whereas the other one we could still say mashkin d'oraita like Rabbi Yehuda. So he says there's a difference between mashkin ba'im machmat yadayim, that they touched a sheni and became a rishon, versus mashkim ba'im machmat sheretz, as opposed to jumping up a level, right? These went down a level from a sheretz to a rishon. That's a much more serious rishon. So when it touches the sheretz and comes down a level, that's when he said we're gonna treat mashkim, right? That's mashkin d'oraita, just the same as anything else, and they can be matame vessels. But when it touches hands that were a sheni and it ups at a level, it only can make food tameh, not vessels. Or here, if it touches the inside, it's not going to mess up the outside. Okay? Or sorry, if it touches the outside, it's not going to mess up the inside. So that's his possible answer. The Gemara doesn't like this answer. They say, if he's basically going to make this distinction between mashkin that came in touch with the sheretz and mashkin that were only the touched yadayim, and the Braita here where it said that Rabbi Yehuda says it's only talking about mashkin and not sheretz, he should have said there mashkim aba'im machmat yadayim and not mashkim that came in contact with the sheretz. So liflag v'litnei bedida, it should have said it explicitly because otherwise it's very confusing. If the inside is, then the outside's tameh, and gabo nitma tocho, and if the outside, then the inside. So basically, it doesn't really make sense that he would say that, and therefore they say, it seems like we're back to square one, that Rabbi Yehuda must have changed his mind, because this source seems to contradict and thinks that mashkin is not the same as sheretz, which means that mashkin is not to oraita l'tamei kelim, yes, food, but not utensils. We'll stop here for today because then we start another question, which is going to be answered tomorrow. So finish here, and that's it for today. So again, just to do a quick review, we started yesterday with all different opinions. Is tumat mashkin from the Torah or from rabbinic in nature? We saw different opinions. Some tried to say it's clearly rabbinic because look at the Beit Mitzvah Chaya. We saw today, maybe you could say, no, it's still D'oraita, but the Beit Mitzvah Chaya was an exception. We saw Shmuel who said, well, it's D'oraita that they become Tameh. It's just not D'oraita that they pass on impurity. And that's how we got to the Beit Mitzvah Chaya, that in the temple, it's only items that they can become Tameh. They just can't pass on impurity. Then we saw Levi and Rav who disagreed about what exactly was the exemption in the temple. Was it the blood and the water, or was it the all the other the things that go on the altar? Okay, and then we just tried to fit those in with the psukim in Haggai, and we tried to fit those in with the Machloket Rav and Shmuel and how that all fit in together. That was a bit of a summary for today's complicated daf. So a few more days and we'll be finished with Tum and Tara. We'll go back to Pesachim. Okay, have a great day.